As they laughed, tying a black man to a pole on the roadside, they had no idea that he was the new police chief, about to change everything. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a warm golden hue over the quiet streets. A solitary figure moved through the urban landscape, his footsteps echoing in the stillness of the late afternoon. Dressed in simple, unassuming clothes, the man, tall, with sharp features and a calm demeanor, looked like anyone you'd pass on the street without a second thought. But today, he wasn't just another pedestrian walking through the city. Today, he was about to become the center of a moment that would change everything for the people in this precinct, and perhaps for the entire community. The officers in the nearby precinct had no idea what was coming. The precinct, tucked in a forgotten corner of the city, was filled with officers who, for the most part, had come to believe in their own unchallenged power. The officers here were used to seeing themselves as the enforcers of justice, the ones who wielded authority with an iron fist. For years, the precinct had functioned as a closed-off world, where a particular type of person could rise to the top, one who fit the mold of what they believed authority should look like. White, powerful, and with a certain air of arrogance that came from being untouchable. But that afternoon, none of them could have predicted the storm that was about to break over them. As the man walked down the street, he passed by the precinct unnoticed, his movements deliberate, yet calm. His presence didn't stand out in the least. To the casual observer, he was just another passerby. But as he neared the entrance of the precinct, one officer, Detective Carter, caught sight of him. There was something about the way he walked, the purpose in his steps that caused Carter to pause. A gut feeling, a sense that something wasn't quite right, flashed through his mind, but he quickly brushed it off, not yet realizing how wrong he was. Inside the precinct, the officers were going about their usual routine, chatting and laughing as they prepared for their shifts. The building was old, filled with the noise of the mundane. Papers shuffled, phones rang, and the low hum of conversations buzzed around the room. They were too caught up in their own world to pay attention to the man walking past outside, too confident in their positions to even consider that someone might be looking at them with a different perspective. But there was one officer who, like Carter, seemed to sense that something was off. Officer Stevens, a newer addition to the precinct, had always kept to himself. He'd noticed the way some of the older officers acted with an air of superiority, how they treated people they didn't deem worthy, with barely disguised disdain. Stevens didn't like the atmosphere of the precinct, but he kept his head down, following the unspoken rules that everyone else followed. Today, though, as he glanced out the window, he saw the same man walking past. He couldn't explain why, but something about the man's calm confidence seemed different from the usual crowd. He didn't belong with the rest of the passers-by. There was an unsettling certainty in the way he moved. It was almost as if he knew something no one else did. The officers inside continued to laugh, oblivious to the turning point that was unfolding just outside their walls. They didn't know who the man was, didn't realize that they were witnessing the calm before a storm. They didn't know that the man walking past their precinct would be the one to tear down the walls they had built around themselves, walls of privilege, arrogance, and racial bias. They didn't know that he was about to step into their world, not just as an outsider, but as the person who would soon hold all the power in the room. As the man continued his walk down the street, he passed a few more officers, their laughter growing louder, their mockery of those who were different more pronounced. He paid them no mind, his eyes fixed ahead, unaware of the growing tension in the air. He wasn't here for them. He wasn't here to engage in their games. But soon, very soon, he would be the one to turn everything upside down. The next few moments would change everything. For them, for him, and for the entire precinct. But for now, all they could do was laugh, ignorant of the monumental shift about to occur. The day seemed to stretch on endlessly as the officers of the precinct carried on with their usual banter, completely unaware of the man who was soon to challenge everything they thought they knew about power. Just as the clock ticked past the hour, the calm outside the precinct gave way to the inevitable. What had been an ordinary day would soon spiral into something none of them could have foreseen. The door swung open, and in walked the man they had seen walking past earlier, his steps slow but deliberate. He entered without fanfare, his presence so understated that it was almost as if he was invisible to those in the room. The officers, preoccupied with their own conversations, didn't take notice at first. They were too absorbed in their own world, too consumed by the routine that had been their life for years. But then, one officer, the one who had noticed the man's quiet confidence earlier, Officer Stevens, looked up. There was a strange unease in Stevens' gut, a feeling that something was about to happen. His instincts were sharp, and he couldn't shake the feeling that the man standing in front of him was not someone they should ignore. The man's calm demeanor, his unshaken composure, it was unsettling. And then, just as Stevens was about to speak up, the man did something that silenced the room. He turned toward the group of officers, and in a voice that was calm yet heavy with authority, he said, "I'm your new police chief." For a moment, the room was silent. The officers who had been laughing and joking moments before froze in place. Their eyes darted from one to another, as if they were trying to make sense of the words that had just left his mouth. This couldn't be real. They had seen him, just a man walking down the street, a nobody. How could he be their new chief? Collins, the most senior officer among them, and the one who had held the precinct under his thumb for years, was the first to break the silence. He let out a low chuckle, almost mocking the man. "You? A police chief?" Collins's voice was laced with disbelief. "You've got to be kidding me. I don't know who you think you're fooling, but you're in the wrong place." But the black man did not flinch. He stood there, unfazed by Collins's sarcastic tone. His expression was calm, but the fire in his eyes told a different story. There was no fear, no uncertainty, just a quiet certainty that made Collins' mockery fall flat. The man stepped forward, the air in the room thickening with every step he took. "I'm not kidding," he said, his voice unwavering. "I am the new police chief, and I'm here to make sure that things change, starting now." The officers were stunned. Some exchanged glances, unsure of how to respond. Others, like Stevens, could feel the tension rise, an unspoken acknowledgement that they were facing something bigger than any of them had anticipated. Collins, however, wasn't done. His pride, his years of ruling this precinct with an iron fist, made him believe that no one, certainly not this man, could take that from him. "Listen," Collins said, his voice lowering as he took a step closer to the man. "You don't just walk in here and declare yourself the chief. It doesn't work that way. I don't know what kind of sick joke you're playing, but you're going to regret it." The black man didn't flinch. He didn't raise his voice or make any sudden movements. He simply stared at Collins with a look of calm authority that made Collins's words seem meaningless. The room seemed to hold its breath. The officers who had been so sure of themselves only moments ago now seemed uncertain, caught in the grip of an unseen force. "You're the one who's going to regret it," the black man said quietly. "You've been running this precinct under false pretenses for too long. But I'm here to set things right. I don't care how you've done things in the past. From now on, things will be different." A nervous energy began to spread throughout the room. The officers who had once supported Collins, the ones who had followed his lead without question, now looked at one another, uncertain. They had always assumed that their power, their positions, were secure. But this man, this stranger, had just shattered that belief with a few quiet words. Collins, who had always relied on his ability to dominate the room, found himself at a loss for words. For the first time in his career, he felt vulnerable. The man's presence was undeniable. The truth hung in the air, thick and heavy, and for the first time, Collins realized that he was no longer in control. The black man turned slowly, addressing the room once more, his voice steady and resolute. "You have a choice," he said. "You can either step aside and work with me, or you can leave. I don't need to prove anything to anyone here, but I will make sure this precinct is a place of justice, not corruption." The room fell silent once again, the officers unsure of what would happen next. But one thing was clear. The black man who had once been just another passerby on the street was now the one who held the power, and it was a power none of them could ignore. The room was silent, and the tension was so thick that it felt almost suffocating. The officers, once so comfortable in their roles, now found themselves caught in the grip of an unexpected reality. Collins, who had always commanded the room with the force of his presence, was now standing there, frozen. He was no longer the one in control, and for the first time, he wasn't sure how to react. His usual bravado had crumbled under the weight of the man's calm authority. The black man, now revealed to be their new police chief, stood in the center of the room, his posture perfect, his expression unyielding. He wasn't arrogant, but there was a quiet power about him that made the officers uneasy. He didn't need to shout or threaten. His presence alone was enough to make them reconsider everything they thought they knew about power. Collins, still stunned, stepped forward, trying to regain some sense of control. His voice was strained, laced with a mixture of anger and disbelief. "I don't care who you say you are," he sneered. "You're not the chief here. Not now, not ever. You're nothing more than a joke." But the black man did not flinch. He simply raised an eyebrow, his gaze never leaving Collins. There was no rush in his response, no need to prove anything. "You think this is a joke, Collins?" he asked, his voice calm but firm. "I'm not here to play games. I'm here to fix the mess you've made of this place." Collins opened his mouth to retort, but before he could get another word out, one of the younger officers, Officer Harris, nervously spoke up. "Maybe we should listen to him," he said, his voice quiet, but unmistakably filled with doubt. Maybe he's right. Maybe it's time for a change." The room seemed to freeze again. Harris's words hung in the air like a lightning strike, breaking the tension that had been building. Some of the other officers, who had been silently watching, began to shift uncomfortably. For the first time, there was a crack in the unity that had held them together under Collins' leadership. Doubts were beginning to creep in. Collins whipped his head around, his face red with fury. "What the hell are you talking about?" he barked at Harris. "Don't you dare turn on me. You know what's at stake here." But Harris, to his credit, stood his ground. "I'm just saying, maybe we've been doing things wrong," he said, his voice now gaining a bit of strength. "Maybe it's time we change the way we work. It's not just about power. It's about justice. The words hit harder than any punch. They were simple, but they carried a weight that none of them could ignore. The officers exchanged glances, and for the first time, they seemed to be questioning the way they had been living and working under Collins's rule. The atmosphere in the room shifted again, the air growing heavier, with the realization that something had to give. The black man, still standing tall, unmoving, watched the scene unfold with quiet patience. He had not raised his voice, not once. He didn't need to. The truth was in his eyes, in the way he carried himself, in the way he refused to back down. It was clear now to everyone in the room that he was not just the new police chief. He was the kind of leader they had never expected, the kind of leader they needed, but hadn't realized until now. Collins, now visibly sweating, was losing his grip. He had always been the one who made the rules, who ran the show with an iron fist. He was used to intimidation, to the fear he inspired in others. But now, as he looked around the room, he saw that his influence was slipping. His own officers were starting to doubt him, to question his authority. In a last-ditch effort, Collins pointed a finger at the black man, his voice shaking with frustration. "You think you can just waltz in here and take over? You think you can make us bow down to you? You don't know what you're dealing with." The black man met his gaze without flinching. "No," he said, his voice steady and clear. "I don't need to make anyone bow down. I'm here to make things right. And if you can't handle that, maybe it's time for you to leave." Collins's face twisted in anger, but he couldn't bring himself to challenge the man in front of him. His power, once so absolute, was crumbling, and he knew it. The officers around him, those who had once followed him blindly, were no longer looking at him with the same reverence. They were looking at him with suspicion, with uncertainty. The cracks in his authority were growing wider, and he couldn't hold them together any longer. The black man, the new police chief, looked at the officers, his expression one of quiet resolve. "It's time to do things differently," he said, his voice carrying the weight of a promise. And as he spoke, the precinct that had once been a place of corruption and power dynamics began to feel, for the first time in years, like a place where true justice might finally be possible. The room stood in a heavy silence. The air was thick with tension, as the last remnants of Collins's authority hung by a thread. The officers, once loyal to him, were now scattered across the room, unsure of what to do, uncertain of what would come next. They had followed Collins without question, been complicit in his methods, his belief that power could be held with force and fear. But now, in this single moment, it was all unraveling before their eyes. The black man, now revealed as the new police chief, stood at the center of the room, unshaken. His eyes swept over the officers, meeting their gazes with a quiet, unflinching intensity. The power dynamics had shifted. The room that had once been a stronghold of Collins' unchallenged authority was now under new leadership, and it was clear to everyone present that this change would be absolute. The man didn't need to raise his voice. He didn't need to say another word. His presence alone had shattered the world they had known. Collins stood before him, visibly deflated. His face, once full of arrogance and confidence, was now pale, his hands trembling slightly as they clenched into fists. He had never felt more vulnerable, more exposed. The smug sense of control he had always carried with him now seemed laughable. He was a man who had spent years making others fear him, who had built his reputation on the backs of those he had crushed beneath his boot. But now, standing before him was a man who didn't fear him, Not in the slightest. And that, more than anything, was what rattled Collins to the core. "I told you," the black man said, his voice low but unwavering. "This precinct isn't yours anymore." The words hung in the air like a proclamation, cutting through the last remnants of resistance. Collins opened his mouth to retort, but no words came. He was beaten. There was no escape from the truth staring him in the face. His power, once absolute, was gone. The man who had walked into this precinct just hours ago as a stranger, an unknown figure, was now its ruler. And there was nothing Collins or anyone else could do to change that. As the black man stood there, his gaze never leaving Collins, something unexpected happened. One by one, the officers who had been silent, who had stood by while Collins ran things with an iron fist, began to shift. Some of them looked down, avoiding eye contact. Others glanced at one another, their expressions unreadable. But there was no mistaking it. Their allegiance to Collins was crumbling. Slowly they began to see what had been right in front of them all along. The black man wasn't just a new face in the room. He was the change they had all been waiting for, the force that would break the chains of complacency and corruption that had bound them for so long. And then, just as the weight of that realization settled in, a voice broke the silence. It was Officer Stevens, who had been the first to question Collins's authority earlier, now stepping forward. His voice was steady, but filled with conviction. I didn't believe it at first," he said, his eyes not leaving the new police chief. "But I see it now. You're the one who's going to fix this place." The words were simple, but they carried immense power. In that moment, it was clear. The shift in the precinct wasn't just about one man taking over. It was about the officers recognizing the truth, that what they had been part of was wrong, that the system they had blindly followed had failed them. The black man had not just defeated Collins's rule, he had inspired something deeper in those who stood by and watched. He had shown them a path to something better. Collins, his face now flushed with rage and humiliation, turned his back on the group, his shoulders slumped in defeat. "You'll regret this," he muttered under his breath, more to himself than anyone else. But the words had no power. They were just a hollow echo of a man who had lost everything. The black man, the new chief, nodded once, acknowledging the moment. He didn't need to respond. His silence was his victory. He had shown them who was in charge, not just by words, but by the strength of his resolve. And in that moment, the officers knew that they had a choice to make: follow this new path, or continue down the one they had been on, a path that had brought them nothing but corruption and fear. "We're not done here," the chief finally said, his voice cutting through the lingering tension. "But we will be, if we work together. It's time for change, and I'm not backing down." With those words, the final shackle that had bound the precinct was broken. The officers stood still for a moment. Then, one by one, they nodded, a silent agreement passing between them. This was no longer about Collins, no longer about power for power's sake. This was about justice. This was about change. And it was happening, right now, right in front of their eyes. Collins walked out of the room, his defeat complete. And as the door clicked shut behind him, a new chapter began for the precinct. A chapter where justice would no longer be a distant dream, but a reality that would shape every decision from that moment on. The power had shifted, and there was no going back. As Collins stumbled out of the precinct, his back to the room he had once controlled, the weight of defeat pressed down on him with a crushing force. His world, once fortified by power and intimidation, had been reduced to rubble in the span of moments. The black man, now the new police chief, had not just taken his title, but had shattered the very foundation of the empire Collins had built. There was no fight left in him now. The precinct, the place he had ruled with an iron fist, had rejected him, and there was nothing he could do to reclaim it. The officers inside the room remained still for a long moment after Collins left. They could hear the muffled sound of his footsteps fading as he disappeared into the distance, and yet no one moved. The weight of the situation settled over them like a heavy fog. The silence was deafening, but it was also filled with something far more significant: uncertainty, confusion, but also a flicker of hope. They had been complicit, yes, but now they had a chance to make things right. The new chief, standing with his back to the door Collins had just exited, slowly turned toward the officers who remained. His gaze was steady, not in anger, but with a calm authority that none of them had ever seen before. He didn't need to say much more. His silence spoke volumes. There was no need for retaliation, no need for empty promises. He had already won, not through brute force, but through the unwavering strength of his resolve and his belief in what was right. Stevens, the officer who had begun to see the cracks in Collins's reign, stepped forward first. His voice, though hesitant at first, grew stronger as he spoke. "You were right," he said, looking directly at the new chief. "We've been living in a world of fear and arrogance. It's time for a change." One by one, the officers began to nod, each of them acknowledging the truth they had avoided for so long. The old ways had failed them. The injustice they had once turned a blind eye to was now staring them in the face, and it was clear. They had to change, or they would become part of the problem. The new chief didn't say much in response. Instead, he simply nodded, his expression a mix of determination and understanding. "We all have work to do," he said quietly, "but we will do it together. No more secrets, no more corruption. From here on out, we do things the right way." With those words, the atmosphere in the room shifted. The power that had once been concentrated in Collins's hands had now spread across the precinct. It wasn't just one man in control anymore. It was the collective will of those who had stood by and let the corruption continue. And now, they were ready to make it right. As the officers stood tall, a new chapter began. A chapter built on the foundation of integrity, fairness, and the promise of a better tomorrow. The precinct would never be the same again. As the new police chief stood in the middle of the precinct, the weight of the moment slowly sank in. The officers, no longer bound by the old ways, were beginning to understand that this wasn't just about a change of leadership. It was about transforming the entire culture of the precinct, rebuilding trust, and striving for something greater than power alone. They had seen firsthand how fragile authority could be, how quickly it could crumble when confronted by integrity and truth. The chief didn't need to make grand speeches or promises. He knew the journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but as he looked around at the officers who had once stood in blind allegiance to Collins, he saw something different in their eyes: respect, perhaps even admiration, for the very principles they had ignored for so long. They were ready to take the first step toward real change. With a quiet nod, the chief turned and walked toward his office, not with arrogance, but with a quiet confidence that spoke volumes. The road ahead was long, but it was clear that the power dynamics had irrevocably shifted. This precinct, once a place of corruption and fear, would now stand as a testament to the strength of doing what's right. And as the doors of the precinct closed behind him, a new chapter began. Not just for the officers, but for the community they served. The lessons learned that day would stay with them forever. True power lies not in dominance, but in fairness, justice, and standing up for what's right. If you were moved by this story, don't forget to leave your thoughts in the comments below. What would you have done if you were in the shoes of the officers? Hit that like button, share with others, and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories of transformation and justice. Let's keep the conversation going.